Hello, you're listening to Streaming Audio, and I'm joined this week by Eric Sammer, who's the CEO of Decodable. And Eric's someone I would describe as an optimistic realist, You can sum up his optimism with something he said to me recently. He said, very confidently, the future of data is real time. And I know he believes that because he's kind of bet his company on it. But no sooner has he said that than that natural New Yorker realism of his kicks in, with a very fair assessment of where we are as an industry right now and where we still have a lot of work to do. And that's what this episode is about. What do we need to do to get to that real-time future faster and more easily and with less pain? I've been kind of thinking back over what we discussed in this episode. Things like, how do we give developers a better mental model of how streaming works? How do we make continuous integration suck less? How do we deal with schema headaches? How are we reacting to the customers demanding that their data be faster? And you think about all of that, and you could almost turn his motto there into a rallying cry. The future of data is real time. Now it's on us to make getting to that future less painful. As you probably know by now, one way we try to make getting to that future a bit less painful is with our education site, Confluent Developer. More about that at the end, but for now, it's time to draw up a roadmap to the future with Eric Sammer. So I'm your host, Chris Jenkins. This is Streaming Audio. Let's get into it. With us today on Streaming Audio, it's Eric Sammer. Eric, how are you?
Very good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Oh, a pleasure. I haven't seen you since Current, when we managed to meet in the real world.
For the first time ever. And maybe we had a little too much fun hanging out there. I think it was such a great conference. It really was. It was such a great event.
Yeah. I really enjoyed it. And I thought for a first time kind of conference, it went really well.
I think so. I really like the expanded format that Confluent did this year. I think including the larger ecosystem of real-time streaming projects and databases, at least for me, I think made the conversations even more interesting, getting more of the totality of like a use case end to end, rather than just the Kafka and stream processing portions of the problem. Anyway, I thought it was just fantastic.
Yeah. Good. I'm glad to hear it. I think it's a natural evolution, if I can be sidetracked by this slightly. It's like when you're a very small technology, you have a small community, you need to have a tightly focused conference.
Yes.
As it kind of grows and goes to being a more mainstream idea, the canvas on which that plays out gets wider, right?
Yeah, and I think people are starting to really think about the sources of all this data and the destinations of this data, and so like it's just like a natural, like you said, evolution of increasing the lens or the aperture that we look through.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're in the streaming data space. You're the CEO of Decodable. And
That's
we're
right.
going to get to that. But I thought, let's start in your history, because this is interesting. You wrote a book. Give me the year. You wrote a book for O'Reilly.
I wrote a book for O'Reilly, and it was published in, I want to say, 2012. I was still at Cloudera at the time, so it's been a hot minute since it was published. Yeah.
And the book was on the glorious world, which I have spent a brief and painful time in, of Hadoop operations.
Glorious is an understatement. I think running Hadoop clusters made you feel like a superhuman if you could get it done.
Yeah.
But yes, I spent a bunch of time early in my career at Cloudera in the professional services field, sort of like running big clusters, big Hadoop clusters and stuff like that. And so it wound up being this like cheat sheet of things that we were doing to, make these things operational. And I got so tired of talking about it that I just wrote it down so I would never have to describe it to anybody ever again.
It's surprising how many technical books and technical talks are essentially, here's my scar tissue.
100%. 100%. And, if you can make that scar tissue helpful to other people, I feel like that's a good thing. It's a mitzvah, right? Like it's a good thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. We can hopefully stop a few injuries for other people on the way.
Yes. Yes.
But so there you are, back in, let's say, 2012, and you're
Mhm.
a Hadoop expert, mapping and reducing day to day. What takes you on on the journey from that to the world of streaming real time data?
Oh man, quite a journey it's been. It's funny. I've never been. I've always just kind of followed, what made sense at the time. And I think at the time, this is, 2012, at least, I believe was like pre Kafka, right? And it was pre the resurgence of stream processing and event streaming in general. So I think like the tech du jour was like ActiveMQ and maybe RabbitMQ and those kinds of systems. So I think
Yeah.
streaming was not as well, it was just like in a different generation of tech. So I think at the time, batch processing just made sense. Hadoop was, a better tech than the other options at the time for doing that kind of processing from a cost effectiveness perspective and a scale perspective. And I think like in between then and now, the big thing that changed for me was building applications in that space. My last startup was basically an observability company, and observability has strong value in reducing the latency of data. And so like there was this
Mm.
natural transition over the period of time to go from batch systems and Hadoop specifically to eventually Kafka and initially Spark streaming, but then, at Rokana, my last company, we wound up switching to Flink very early on. And then through my career at Splunk and now Decodable, I've been working with Flink and Kafka, Pulsar, all the event streaming real time infrastructure for the last, my goodness, like 8 years, something. Yeah.
You've got the whole checklist there, I
I
think.
do. I'm fully buzzword compliant, Chris. Fully.
Excellent. So let's talk about this briefly because we need to push through into your dealing with customers here, I think. But so Decodable is real time stream processing. That's the problem you're trying to solve, right? Give me the proper
That's it.
pitch.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. So we don't actually focus on the event streaming like broker infrastructure. So we work with obviously Kafka probably makes up at least 50, 60 percent of the customers that we work with, but other event streaming systems as well, and provide the connectors and the stream processing engine, which is based on Apache Flink. And the interface that we give to folks is basically SQL. We try and make it as serverless as possible. So if you write a SQL query, we'll parse, plan, deploy that job in the cloud. So we're a cloud service. Yeah.
Right. So let's just try and expose the world of SQL for real time streaming somehow, right?
Right. And I don't think that we're certainly not the first to do this. I mean, like I said, we are based on Apache Flink under the hood. Obviously, there's KSQLDB. There's like lots of other systems that do this. Even Spark streaming or structured streaming. It's always a mouthful to say. Structured streaming with SQL. No offense to my friends who work on Spark. So I think that there's plenty of systems out there. Our focus has really been about the developer experience and making that as simple as possible. So like zero configuration, zero tuning, zero cluster allocation, those kinds of things. And in fact, we wind up working with the larger ecosystem of every other project that I just mentioned. For cases where maybe SQL isn't the best choice. You need to do fancy ML infrastructure and drop down a layer into like
Hmm.
Java or Scala APIs, those kinds of things, or Python. So I think we're not sort of religious about like, oh, you should be doing everything as SQL. I mean, obviously we feel like that is most effective for people, but I don't think it's the only way to do things.
Yeah, yeah. And there is no one tool that fits the job, right?
No.
But this pushes through into where I really want to pick your brains, developer experience you mentioned. And I think sometimes I think SQL is a double-edged sword here because it's familiar and it kind of makes a certain logical sense for processing a series of rows, whether they're in a table or they're in a stream, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it raises one of the common objections. If I've got this SQL interface to transform some data, why don't I just use a relational database? What's the whole point of this streaming thing people are talking about?
Yeah, I think you know we certainly hear this a lot. I'm sure you probably still hear this a lot, in your role. But I think there are sort of legit objections. I think um, there's a couple of objections. One is, we hear a lot. This use case doesn't need streaming, and I think the root of that has been coming from a place where there's like this natural implicit objection that's buried in that sentence that has to do with people bring up the cost of streaming because it's always
Hmm.
on. And so if you have like a trickle of data or like lower volume, those kinds of things, um, it might not be cost effective. We hear objections about, well, the data actually doesn't show up as a stream, right? The data shows up in batches, and so like maybe that makes sense. And I think that and then there's questions about the actual engines and the technology. Like maybe we should just do this on some large data warehouse or relational database system. And I think that there are probably different reasons for each one of those things. So I don't think it's always like a simple discussion. But my perspective generally is, all things being equal, fresher data delivered faster. I've never encountered a case where that's a bad thing, right? Like I've never encountered a case that actually, like, you could argue like the value might not be like orders of magnitude, but in most instances there is value in that. Training models on fresher data or viewing fresher data in a report or something like that. You can say that like, well, we don't require that, but fundamentally it's not a bad thing, right? Like, I mean, like, there are use cases certainly that benefit more than others, but I think it's not a bad thing. I think that the real sort of sticking point for a lot of people is just that like streaming in general is just still has a lot of pain associated with configuration and deployment, and like the tech stack's a little bit different and weird. And I mean, let's face it, like running something like Postgres, you can spin up a Postgres database in 5 minutes and like mostly be production ready. I mean, like mostly, with modern cloud services. And I think that the streaming world has not quite caught up to that level of maturity and sophistication. And I think that that's the place that causes a lot of this kind of stuff. I don't know. Does that make sense for you?
Yeah, a lot of what you said does. I think I'm going to start by pushing back on the spinning up a database. I think
Mm,
there are now a lot of cloud services, and I'm going to include Confluent in this, but let's
yeah.
be broad. There are a lot of places online where you can spin up a lot of different kinds of databases and have them
Hmm.
to be production ready quickly. But
Yeah.
I think the bigger issue is spinning up the Postgres instance is probably the most familiar thing.
I think, there is a very high likelihood that you're right. And that like a lot of this is just familiarity bias, like the thing that we know feels more robust or feels better. I actually don't know the answer, but either way, there is this perception that streaming is hard. Right. And so
Hmm.
like even if you set aside the reality, I mean, you and I live in this world, but like, if you set that aside and you just look at sort of the perception of things, the perception out there is still that this is complicated and that it's expensive, and that it has sort of weird quirks, in terms of like the semantics and event time and late arriving data and all these other kinds of things. Um, and I recognize those objections.
Hmm.
I hear them. I think that part of this is education, and I think we spend a lot of time on that. But I think a lot of it is just meeting people where they are. And so, if the perception is that way, I think it actually behooves us to like really look at that and figure out why is the perception that way. Like where is that coming from? And I think for a lot of people, it's just one. It's perceived as like a Java ecosystem still.
Yeah, yeah, that's really unfortunate, I think.
Right. And you and I know that that's not necessarily true, but like the perception is that like, when something goes wrong, you're reading a stack trace. Right. And like, those kinds of things leak out into the developer experience. And I think cause and exacerbate this feeling of things not being either production grade or being very Java centric or being very complicated.
Yeah, yeah, which is a huge shame because I think there are very few databases out there that are so associated with the language they're written in. No one sees Postgres as primarily a C language thing,
Right.
right? Yeah.
Right. And I think, I think to be fair to the people who gripe about this, it's true. I think in a lot of cases, and like coming from like, to our earlier discussion, like the Hadoop ecosystem, like a stack trace is not an error message. Right. And like, I think if you know what I mean, like, yes, it is an error
It's
message, but
it's
like,
almost a book about the error message, right?
right, right. It's Hemingway about, about an error. But I think those kinds of things bite people and make it feel like it's not ready, or that it's not for them.
Mm. Yeah, but from where we're standing, I think you're right that we have to listen to those objections and deal with them, right? And I'm not trying to sell anyone on it, but at the same time, I recognize that actually it is a good way to deal with data, particularly at scale, particularly when you're spanning multiple machines, and the speed of data processing and the real time nature of it is important. So, how do we begin to persuade, reassure, support, fix problems? Where do we tackle that enormous blob of how do I build a bridge for you from there to here? Because I think here is good.
Mm. Yeah, this is something I think we as an industry collectively um, probably spend a lot of time on. I think one is uh, is the various APIs and the way of expressing logic, right? And so there are, you know, language specific APIs, Java, Scala, but also thinking about Python and JavaScript and
Mm,
TypeScript and all these other languages as first class citizens. Um, and I would include SQL because I think it winds up being a different kind of, it can be a different kind of user or a different skill set. I think SQL, with all of its warts, and it does have its warts, right? I mean, it does have there's a reason people are constantly trying to reinvent SQL. Like, let's be
yeah, and
honest.
abstract away from it, right?
Exactly, and abstract away from it. A religious war that will go on forever. For all of its warts, tons of people know it, and it includes data engineers and data scientists and business analysts and like people who might not be distributed systems people or thinking about class loaders and sort of lower level APIs and those kinds of things,
Yeah, yeah,
especially for simple stuff like the streaming ETL style use cases of just like prep, transform, filter, route, aggregate, those kinds of things. I think SQL is very good at those things. Um, so I think APIs and sort of access is one whole bucket, and then I think this like fit and finish and paper cut stuff around everything from error messages to code deployment models.
yeah,
Um, Building streaming applications feels more like building microservices, right? So like by definition, right, like you can be building Docker containers and deploying things into Kubernetes, and like it is a different level than, for instance, building like writing something in DBT with Airflow against Snowflake or Databricks, right? And so like I think when you compare those two developer experiences, you start
mm,
to realize, oh wait, okay, like now I understand where the complexity comes from. Because like I'm thinking about like a lower level set of abstractions. Now again, like I think there are systems like Decodable, like KSQLDB, like other things like that that try and up level away from that. So the question there is like really, how much can we make it feel similar to people around the workflow
Mm.
the CI/CD, the testing, the integration, like those kinds of things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does. It makes me think like the whole microservices analogy. One thing we have realized, I think, as an industry, is that monitoring has to be a first class citizen.
Yeah.
But we
Yeah.
haven't quite got there with things like continuous deployment, which is another thing that microservices kind of really
Yeah.
need at the heart.
I think microservices, like by definition, like is one more piece of infrastructure that is always on. That has, which means that it has all the operational characteristics, the security, the access control, the access control, the auditing, the monitoring, the observability are associated with the alerting, like who's going to wake up in the middle of the night when it doesn't work, the failure and recovery, and like all these kinds of things, and things like Kubernetes and those kinds of things help with it.
Mm.
But I don't necessarily. I don't think it's like it might not even be a problem per se, but it is an extra set of things versus like writing a YAML file or a small chunk of SQL and like committing it to Git, and like having like magic happen out the other
Yeah,
side. So
yeah,
I
yeah.
think it's just, you know, I don't think it's either or. I think it's about enabling both experiences to be as simple as possible, where building a streaming application with like the lower level APIs, sort of the programmatic APIs of Java or Scala or something like that, being akin to building like a Spring Boot app or, a Django app. I don't speak Python, but like, whatever the latest greatest framework is, or
Yeah.
like a Node application. And writing SQL queries should, in streaming data, feel and work about as similar as using dbt, Airflow, Snowflake, or Databricks. Right? Like I think it needs to be in that level of familiarity for people to be effective.
Yeah, yeah. If I can take one pot shot locally, I think one place where we're not quite there is things like KSQL, right? It has a migration tool, so you can apply migrations. It's okay. It's not fully featured yet, and almost no one seems to know about it.
Right.
It's an underdeveloped tool. Is there anything like in that sort of space that you've worked on?
Yeah, I mean, in general, the issue of schema migrations, and I would consider state migrations as being part of that,
Hmm.
in the streaming world, I think it needs an awful lot of work. Right. And we think a lot about this as Decodable, and I don't know that we fully cracked this nut. I don't think anybody has really fully cracked this nut just yet. But like, I think that whole process is different. That's a place that is truly different between
Mm.
streaming and batch. Is sort of the how those things work, and uh, you know, um, I think it's an additional concern for people to worry about, and like you said, because it's sort of additional above and beyond. I think what someone would wind up doing in batch data engineering or development of pipelines. Um, it's probably people don't know to look for it, and I think that might be why these kinds of tools are underused.
Mm. Yeah. Do you think we're going to get to the point where that kind of experience is as seamless as it can be?
I think so. I think we have to. I mean, the excitement is there. The use cases are there.
Mm.
I think that people want. I think the big thing that's changed over the last 10 years, and I think the birth of things like Kafka and obviously you and the team at Confluent have really paved the way for I think a lot of this. You know, the use cases have caught up to the technology, right? Logistics, retail, healthcare, IoT, all of these kinds of things have actually caught up to the technology in that people want and expect, these kinds of applications to be real-time applications.
Yeah,
And so I
yeah,
think as a result, that means that the technology needs to go the last 10 or 20% in terms of like fit and finish to be accessible to absolutely every developer out there. I think it's
yeah.
going to be a core skill set.
Yeah, I think that relates to something that, like, I think the real driver to streaming adoption, more than anything, is going to be the customer, the end user.
Yes.
Like, you couldn't imagine setting up a rival to Uber for taxi cabs that didn't show you live where the car was, right? The
Right.
customer now demands that.
Right.
You couldn't compete well with Amazon if you didn't have the constant parcel tracking, and you can literally see on Amazon how many stops it is from your
Right.
house, right? The customer's demand is going to push us, the developers, to do a better job, which will in turn push people like you and I to do a better job of the tooling to enable it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And to me, that forcing function is a very healthy thing. It sort of forces us to grow and mature as, as the underlying infrastructure to support these things. As, maybe companies out there who have put off the adoption of streaming because like it's too complicated or it's too expensive, or the tooling isn't mature enough or whatever, you know they are now at a point where they're sort of really pushed to the edge, and they effectively have to do this because, like you said, their customers demand it. Like the expectation is there in banking that, when I buy something, it shows up. I'm not stopped if it's not fraudulent, and it actually shows up in my bank account that like I've actually spent that money, reasonably quickly. I think people just have that expectation now, and I think that that's like the healthiest forcing function in the world, because it's not technology for technology's sake anymore.
Yeah, it's serving the customer, which we will always bend over to do, right?
Yes,
We'll always flex into the right shape to do that. Do you see
I
that
think
a
that's
lot?
right.
Because you deal directly with customers a lot more than I do. Do you see that a lot in the field? That kind of demand that they must catch up with?
I do. I do. I mean, when we talk to people, we either they are people at the sort of at the forefront of this, where they kind of are doing this strategically, and someone, excuse me, in their space has not done it yet.
Mm,
So like when I talk to people, I kind of say like who are your competitors? Like what does your space look like? Because I'm always really interested to learn about, how they like what their set of constraints and like what their environment looks like.
mm.
And they'll tell you, like, well, so and so, no one's doing real time, and we feel like we need to do it because it's a strategic advantage over everybody else.
Yep,
Or one of our or two of our other competitors have started to do it, and we're feeling the pressure from our customers to do it too. And like, I have
yep.
not met anybody who isn't in one of those two camps. I'll be honest with you.
Yeah. And if you can, it's better to be the person leading rather than the person playing catch up, right?
Yeah, it's one of those things like, streaming isn't a thing until your competitor does it, right? I mean, you could argue that like that's true of everything. I mean, going back some number of years, like nobody had a mobile application, right?
Mm.
And your competitor started to have mobile applications, and then like more and more of the compute moved to mobile devices, and like eventually you felt like the pain of not having a first class mobile experience. And so like now it's not controversial to say we should have a first class mobile experience if you're like a B2C company, and maybe
Yeah,
even a
yeah,
B2B company.
yeah,
So I think, these kinds of things are just becoming first class, problems for folks.
yeah. It's it's interesting because I think maybe what we're going to come to the conclusion of is there are some technologies that just exist to make the company's life easier, right? If you move to AWS, your customer doesn't care. You're not doing it for their sake. You're doing it for your costs and your maintenance issues.
Right.
But streaming might be in that category where we're actually doing it for the external world, for their sake. And that's why the
I
drivers of it feel slightly different.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I think so. And I think, there are things that, like you said, are purely internal, that are about like cost management or efficiencies and those kinds of things. And those things are valuable. But I think that the thing about streaming is that it can actually be like, it can actually be like a revenue generator or a customer retention and sort of happiness generator, like a CSAT, generator or something like that. And I think those kinds of things are, in a lot of ways, maybe more exciting and more sort of obvious that they have sort of high value for folks.
Yeah. So do you find that when you go into a business, if they're being pushed by their competitors or their customers, what's the sticking point for them? Is it management saying we must do it and the developers struggling to catch up, or is it developers saying we ought to do it and management not really taking in that the world should change, or what is it?
Yeah, I mean it's a good question, and you and I were talking, even before we started here, and I think that it's worth pointing out that companies are not homogenous, right? There are teams within an
Mm,
organization who might be pushing where other teams might not be, and so I mean, I'd be curious to hear what you see, but from my vantage point, it's typically that a specific team has a use case or something that acts as sort of like the driver, the forcing function to put this infrastructure in place. And then
yeah.
once it's there, all of a sudden everybody around it starts to immediately feel the benefits. And like then all of a sudden, like it's like a magnet for use cases. Like it's obvious that all of these other things should also go real time or event based.
Yeah.
So at financial services companies, like fraud detections, like the evergreen space, like where somebody goes like, wow, if we could detect fraud better, we save more money or we help more people, whatever the case may be.
Mm,
um, but I do think it's actually happening bottom up, because I don't think that, like, I mean, that's not true. I guess I have seen it, but like it's rare that like a VP plus level person goes, what we need to do? We need to be, real time. I think what it winds up being is that it materializes as like, um, our model recommendations, our product recommendations aren't as good as they should be. And like one of the reasons why is because they don't include like intra-session behavior,
yeah, yeah.
or something like that, or our fraud rate is greater than we want it to be because we don't detect it fast enough. And so I think that winds up pushing, and then a team decides, some poor underappreciated engineer someplace goes, like the right way to do with this is, Kafka plus, stream processing and all these other kinds of things.
Yeah, yeah. It relates to the. I mean, I think I can unify those two perspectives by saying, particularly the banks I've worked for, the large enough companies, they always behave like a cluster of small companies.
Right.
And like all small companies, they have some user out there that's particularly demanding real time. And once they get it, the other small companies within your bank see it and demand it and want to compete with it.
I think that's absolutely right. And I do think, most of what we do
Mm,
is continuous data processing. Like let's set aside real time and batch for a second. The thing
yeah.
that we are doing is continuous processing of event based data, and batch and real time or streaming are sort of implementations of that. And I think that the second you get sort of the infrastructure in place, all of a sudden it's very obvious that like everything should kind of work, can actually use this shared real time substrate, because it can serve both of those use cases. And we've seen, and I'm sure you've seen, that some of the connectors that sort of like, or source systems produce or produce data in batches. Some produce in real time, some consume in batches, some consume in real time. But
Hmm.
fundamentally, the processing in the middle winds up being continuous. And I think that that is a nice way of being able to serve both of those kinds of use cases in different departments, and a way of sort of handing data between different teams and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think fundamentally, real time streaming can be a superset of batch. You
Yes.
can always slow it down and do it in larger chunks and end up with what batch can do for you. But I think we might find, because we always think about programming and building systems the way we think about the world, right? And you get people who say, well, the world is obviously object oriented because
Mm.
I think about the world, I see the world, and it's like different objects relating to each other in different ways. So my mental model of programming is object oriented. I'm going somewhere with this, I promise you. My mental model is object orientation is the way the world works, right? If you think about it in that light, when we do programming and we're trying to have a natural model of things, the way we exist, the way we live, is reacting to stimuli in real time. I don't process today by thinking, what did I do yesterday? Let me go through the list of things I did 24 hours ago and deal with that now. No, I'm constantly
Right.
reacting to the real world around me.
Yeah, I think most things are when this, do that,
Mm,
right?
yeah,
And I think you're 100% right. I mean, if the human brain is really just like, if memory is state and external stimuli or events,
yeah,
then like that's the world, right? Like
yeah,
it's, I mean, actor models model this, and I think stream processing models this. I think it's, get all the right signals in, keep the right state, process in real time, totally makes sense.
yeah. So I have hope because of that, that we can, once we iron off, polish off the rough edges, that this model will fit quite naturally in most developers' heads.
I,
But
I
we need to
think
get
that
there.
I hope that you're right. I want you to be right. I really do.
You've kind of bet the
Um,
company on something like that being true.
yeah, I think we've placed our bets, you and I.
Yeah.
But I think that you're right. I think we will get to a place where stream processing is more like um, microservices, or more like REST APIs, or more like, those kinds of things, where it's a core assumption of the way that we build systems. And I think that, I mean, let's be honest, like I think the leaders have already done it. I think the leaders in retail, the leaders in logistics, the leaders in security, pick your favorite industry, have
Mm.
actually already done this. And I think that, that is pretty apparent. The rest is just about sort of helping everybody else to get there.
So, how are we going to get there, right? How are we going to enable people? Are we going to build particular tools, address particular concerns? Where do you want the world of streaming to be 3 years from now?
Yeah, I think that's the question for us to figure out. I don't think it's about speeds and feeds and about reducing latency and sort of, those kinds of things. I think we'll naturally continue to do those things. I mean, there's plenty of work, I think, going down that path. Instead, I think it's going to be about opening up to a larger number of developers and a larger number of use cases. And I think that is going to be predicated on the APIs, the developer experience, the languages that they use to build those applications.
Mm.
And, we talked a little bit about this, like making other non-Java JVM based languages, I think, a first class citizen, and like reducing that sort of kind of barrier for folks. I think that there does need to be better education for people, and maybe greater motivation for them to engage with the education around some of the nuances of streaming, dealing with late arriving data and state management. And
Mm.
you and I talked about things like schema management and state migrations and those kinds of things. I
Yeah, yeah.
think their like tooling can improve, visibility into the systems can improve, debugability of those systems can improve. And then, yes, there needs to be an educational component about teaching people the best practices for doing that in databases. We know what those are. Like, we know how to do schema evolution and all these other kinds of things. And I think that we need to reduce we need to have a similar experience on the streaming side, where there's
Hmm.
just like burned in best practices that, like, you'd be crazy to ignore, that are like the right way to deal with this kind of stuff. And I think, to whatever degree we can, we need to reduce the number of technologies or like subsystems that people need to learn. When people use existing batch infrastructure, they kind of know about the relational database. I think in the streaming world, we're asking them to learn about multiple services, multiple APIs, multiple serialization formats. Like, these are things
Mm.
that they don't have to deal with. I think we need to make all of that go away, in order for streaming to really, really, really hit mainstream, full scale mainstream adoption across all potential people that could adopt. What do
Okay.
you think? Does that
Yeah,
make sense?
it does make sense, but let's pick one of those specifically. What would you do? Because it is weird. I agree that it's weird in particularly in the Kafka world, that schema isn't baked into the system. You get a
Yeah,
database, there is one schema, and you never think about deserialization and serialization of bytes, but you have no
right,
choices.
right.
And what would you do? Would you say Avro or nothing, or what would you do,
Yeah,
Eric?
I think it should just disappear. Right. I think that, there's very little value in that level of configurability for people. I think at the edge of the systems, like the connectors, there you should deal with translation of serialization, deserialization, for instance. But like once it's in a topic, as long as the client APIs work, the idea that the customer really, really cares about the serialization format, I think as long as it fulfills their needs, I actually think it doesn't matter.
Hmm.
And I think it should be entirely a client library, side concern. And I think if you did that, you could make tons of really common mistakes disappear. And
Yeah.
I think those are the kinds of things that we think about when I say developer experience, like places where the optionality provides no value to a developer and it's just one more piece of cognitive overhead. There's no value in it. We should get rid of it.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think the more that we do that, the better off we are.
Because I think it's the way we've evolved, right? We have gone from this is a new idea and we're figuring out how to make it scale and latency and performance and those things that you talk about. We have kind of reached the point where the production readiness of this idea is proved and the how we do it is largely proved. And we're entering this field of refinement. That's why we've
Yeah.
got schemas as a second phase concern. And
Right.
we're going to be simultaneously integrating all these pieces we've realized we need along the way and responding to the customers demanding that this happens. And we've got this mishmash of us as developers trying to balance the ship, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. And so I think that, if you only have a certain amount of, mental CPU cycles as a developer to learn this stuff, we should be thinking about, we as sort of like the people who build these kinds of things should be thinking about where do we want to burn those cycles. And I'll be honest with you, I don't think it's on JSON versus Avro versus protobuf. Like that is just
Yeah.
not the right place to
Yeah.
burn CPU cycles for a developer. It's just not, as long as it works with all the systems they need it to work with.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sometimes taking away choice is a great thing, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And
I,
shifting it to where it has, a substantial value or advantage to people. Now, of course, you do need to solve their problems. I mean, people need to move things like video frames and those kinds of things. So you need like binary data types, and you need flexible, schema data types, and like those kinds of things. So I think that there's probably work to be done there. But I think it starts with acknowledging that, like, byte arrays are probably not the right interface for 99.9% of the population.
yeah. Yeah. And in fairness, the relational world hasn't freed itself from those problems. Every few years, they introduce a new type to cope up with the way the world's going. I mean, JSON types are in practically every relational database now and weren't 10 years ago.
Right.
Right?
Right.
That problem
Yeah.
will
So I
always be
think
with us on both sides of the fence.
there's definitely trapdoors, I think, for more sophisticated use cases. The question is whether you make people with a simple use case deal with like all of the trapdoors, or can they do like 80% of their workloads if they have to like, filter and aggregate some data, if they need to understand partition keys and like all these other kinds of things, like do their eyes glaze over and like they stop thinking, you know what I mean? Like I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
just like a real thing.
I know exactly what you mean. And yet it feels, on this side of the fence, it feels slightly unfair because they suffered to learn COD's rules and denormalization and normalization and what a primary key is.
I think there is something to be said for that. And so the question is, which of those things are our equivalents? And I think the conceptual side, yes, that makes sense to ask people to expend a little bit of extra, effort in terms of like ramping on a new technology. You and I have talked in the past about things like programming languages and, functional programming and those kinds of things. I think there are certain concepts that you probably want to spend some CPU cycles to learn. And then there's like everything else. And, I have a bee in my bonnet about schemas and serialization formats and those kinds of things, especially in a world where like everybody and their mother, uses a particular serialization format. And then but we have all these trapdoors to like deal with other stuff.
So in your ideal future world, people will never think about serialization formats, but they'll still stop and consider what joins are like when you've got infinite streams.
I think so, yes. So I think that like joins and thinking about event time and thinking about schema migrations and state migrations, those things I think are all things that make sense to focus on in terms of like education and helping people to ramp, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. That kind of leaves me with some hope. We've got some work to do on sanding off the rough edges. We've got some education, but I think we can reasonably expect customers to force developers to learn these things, which you've got to learn along the way, right?
I think so, and I'm very biased. I sort of have a horse in this race, but my sense is that our approach to this has been to, in places where we can leverage pre-existing knowledge, we prefer to do that. And we reserve those like that cognitive load for places where there's high value, which is why like we chose SQL at Decodable, like I said, for better and worse, with all of its warts. So I do think that like there are various ways that we can embody this for people and kind of meet them where they are. I think that's like always the thing that comes up for me, is to meet people where they are.
Yeah. And maybe choose our battles and avoid some battles entirely for some people, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the battle best fought is the one that you don't fight, right? Like, that's I'm butchering some expression somewhere.
I think that's Sun Tzu, isn't it? The art of war.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I learned something today.
You're clearly a New Yorker because you're going with the war metaphor.
Oh my God. Not on purpose, which is worse. It tells you that it's like fully baked into who I am.
Deeply ingrained in your nature.
Yes.
Eric, on that all too revealing note of your personality, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us.
Chris, it was a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
See you again. And there we are. Streaming audio. Come for the real-time data processing. Stay for those penetrating psychological insights into the guests. If you'd like to hear more from Eric, we do actually have another podcast with him from a few episodes back, where he was a guest on a panel discussion we had about real-time data versus batch data. If you haven't heard it, there's a link in the show notes, or you can probably just scroll back to November 2022, depending on how you're picking this episode up. Also, depending on how you're picking this episode up, there might be a like button or a rating button or a subscribe button to click. And, I'm not saying anything specific. I'm just pointing out those buttons are there if you have any need to click on things. Something else that's sitting there waiting for you is developer.confluent.io. We talked a lot in this episode about how education is one vital part of the future of real-time data. And Confluent Developer is how we're trying to get to that part of that future. If you head there, you can find courses teaching you the specifics of how Kafka works, but also like information covering the bigger, more abstract ideas, like how do you architect a real-time system? How do you model events? How do you think about joins? So for answers to those kinds of questions, check out developer.confluent.io. And with that said, it remains for me to thank Eric Sammer for joining us and you for listening. I've been your host, Chris Jenkins, and I will catch you next time.